Hola, bienvenidos al primer podcast de Azul Nutrition. Este va a ser un episodio muy especial, no solo porque sea el primero, sino porque vamos a estar hablando con el doctor Mike Israetel. Vamos a ver qué tan fuerte levantar si quieres ganar masa muscular, cómo identificar el estímulo de diversos ejercicios, hacer sentadillas en la Smith y más. Todos mis diálogos están doblados al español, sin embargo, todo lo que diga Mike está en inglés. Por eso, si no sabes inglés y quieres aprovechar el contenido de este video, puedes verlo haciendo clic en los subtítulos de YouTube. Eso sería todo, espero que les guste y quédense hasta el final si tienen miedo al COVID de rodillas. Mike, bienvenido, gracias por estar aquí, es un honor hablar contigo hoy. Primero me gustaría empezar con una pequeña introducción. Estoy seguro que algunos escuchando conocerán a Mike. Para aquellos que no lo hagan todavía, Mike es una figura muy respetada de la comunidad del fitness. Mike, tienes un PhD en Fisiología del Deporte de la Universidad de East Tennessee. Actualmente trabajas como profesor en el programa de maestría de fuerza e hipertrofia del Lehman College y también trabajas con Renaissance Periodization, la compañía que ayudaste a fundar. A lo largo de tu carrera has enseñado múltiples cursos a lo largo de distintas universidades, incluyendo nutrición para la salud pública, nutrición deportiva y ejercicio. Por último, en cuanto a tu carrera deportiva, compites profesionalmente en Jiu-Jitsu brasileño y también como fisicoculturista, de hecho tomando el segundo lugar recientemente en la categoría de Master Super Heavies. ¿Es correcto?
I think that's very good. Thank you so much for that very nice intro.
Genial. ¿Empezamos con las preguntas?
Of course.
La primera pregunta es, actualmente muchas personas entienden la importancia de la sobrecarga progresiva en su entrenamiento. Sin embargo, a menudo las personas que van al gimnasio escuchan sobrecarga progresiva y el término tensión mecánica e inmediatamente asumen, lo que tengo que hacer es añadir tanto peso como pueda a la barra, levantar los pesos más pesados. ¿Podrías explicarnos algunos de los problemas con sobreenfatizar la carga en cambio de otras variables como sería la técnica, el rango de movimiento y el volumen de entrenamiento?
Yeah, that's something that occurs relatively frequently as people think overload. And, overload perhaps isn't the best term. Unfortunately, it's a term that's pretty well settled, and a lot of people are using it. And it's sort of a term we've inherited. It has load right in the name, so it's very difficult to surmise that it has only to do with load. But, overload, there's really a better term for it, is probably stimulus. You want to stimulate hypertrophy. And the way you do that is you lift weights that are relatively heavy, which is to say something between a 5 repetition and 30 repetition maximum, and that you lift with an adequate amount of volume, number of sets per session and per week, and that you lift close enough to muscular failure to make sure that the faster twitch muscle fibers have been activated sufficiently and trained. And of course, range of motion means that not only do you get the best stimulus if you get into a very deep stretch under tension, but also you stimulate most of the muscle fibers by going through a full range of motion, because partial ranges tend to stimulate only part of the entire muscle, and thus you can't very likely get full hypertrophy without doing at least a greater range of motion. And technique ties into that because it enhances range of motion. It makes you preferentially use certain muscles versus others, and it of course enhances safety. And I think people, take a term like progressive overload and they think, okay, the more weight I put on the bar, the better. And if you really think about that, if you really believe that load is everything, then you would only train with 1 repetition maxes all the time. And we know that powerlifters train more often with 1 repetition maxes, and they're not as muscular as bodybuilders. And when powerlifters decide to become more muscular, they usually do more volume. So we've known from a bunch of studies that so long as the weight is challenging and is close to failure, sets of 5 to 30 repetitions, volume is actually a bigger determinant than differences in load. So for example, if someone asked you, okay, what's better for hypertrophy for the average person? Is it 5 sets of 15 repetitions at 70% of your 1 rep max, or let's say 65? Or is it 1 set of 1 repetition at 100% of your 1 rep max? And if you really thought load was supreme, then you would say, well, the latter is probably better, and that would be very incorrect, and you wouldn't grow a lot of muscle. So I think overload should be understood that you're challenging the physiology by lifting appropriately heavy, lifting closer to failure, and lifting with appropriate volume. And then progression can occur generally through the small addition of load and or the small addition of repetitions, and or if necessary, the addition of the number of sets that you're doing. And it can happen in a bunch of other small nuanced ways, but those are kind of the main three. If you get really technical, volume is more autoregulatory. So repetition addition and or load addition is the best, but adding reps is kind of boring and isn't as cool. So a lot of people don't talk about it. And then they end up using weights that are very, very heavy, and they sacrifice how much volume they can do, because if you use much heavier weights, oftentimes you cannot do as many sets and you can't do as many reps. And then they end up actually growing less. So I think it's a good idea to see everything in context.
De hecho, parece estar esta noción especialmente alrededor de levantadores naturales, que uno debería dedicar al menos unos mesociclos por año a tratar de volverse tan fuerte como sea posible si el objetivo es ganar masa muscular. No fases de descanso activo o de resensibilización, sino periodos de fuerza. ¿Qué piensas de esta aproximación? ¿Hacerte más fuerte te vuelve más grande?
I think one of the reasons that natural lifters have gotten into this is because compared to enhanced lifters, they're not as big or as strong. And so they want to feel a little better about themselves in the gym. And so if they program strength, what they can do is lift physically heavier weights that look cooler. And then they can operate under the illusion that this somehow increases their hypertrophic potential over the long term. And there's neither any evidence nor conjecture to think that that's the case. There's also no evidence or conjecture to think that this somehow operates differently in naturals and enhanced lifters. So I think a lot of the thing comes down to natural lifters are tired of squatting 60, 70, and 80 kilos for sets of 10. They want to squat 100, 110, 120 kilos. And they can only do that for sets of 3 or 5. And so they say, oh, I'm doing a strength block, and they make up this idea that it's going to somehow make them bigger. And I think that non-charitably, it's a stupid idea. Charitably, it's at least more complicated and not clearly in evidence that that's always going to lead to more growth, perhaps in most cases.
También es ego muchas veces. Está bien si quieres levantar pesado, pero tienes que reconocer que va a haber algo que vas a tener que dejar en cambio.
Yeah, totally. So, there's nothing wrong with getting strong. There's a difference between just getting strong for its own merits and then telling yourself, well, the reason I'm getting strong is because it's going to make me bigger. Is that really true? I don't know. It's one of those things where if you know some sports science, you start to try to think it through, and it doesn't immediately make a whole lot of good sense. You start to think, okay, maybe it's more complicated. Then you start to add in layers of complexity, and it still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I have a PhD in sport physiology. I'm a professor of this stuff, and it still doesn't make any sense to me. So maybe I've lost something there. But generally speaking, when you're training for strength, you're doing lower volumes, and that's times when you're not growing. And so there's a big opportunity cost there. The cool thing is you get stronger, which is awesome. But time spent getting stronger is time not spent getting bigger. And I think the natural thing is just total red herring. Has nothing to do with any of the considerations at hand.
Y viola la especificidad. Es tiempo que no estás levantando para ser tan grande como podría ser.
100%. So, most people stop their reasoning at just what economist and philosopher Thomas Sowell would call a notion. It's just an idea it's not a hypothesis even. It's just something people say and they think they believe. They don't really think about. On YouTube, you'll see a lot of comments like, this kind of training works for drug users, but natties need strength training. And I think very few people have actually responded to comments on this. Why? And you just don't really hear anything back. I know that a lot of natural bodybuilders just culturally like to compete in powerlifting as well as bodybuilding. And that's cool. But it doesn't mean one makes you better at the other. I mean, bodybuilding can make you better at powerlifting by adding muscle size. I'm not entirely sure how powerlifting makes you better at bodybuilding. As a matter of fact, you could make a very good argument that it probably costs something. And we can make a sort of kind of a mental experiment here and say, okay, like if aliens came to Earth and they said you have 1 year to get as big as possible naturally, what fraction of that year would you dedicate to pure strength training and competing in powerlifting? I suspect a reasonably intelligent person who knows something about training would probably err on the side of close to zero. And why? Because I only have a year. I got to get as much muscle as possible. So almost all the training that isn't excessively fatiguing needs to be hypertrophy oriented. And we don't even have to make that crazy of a leap. We can say, okay, if you're a high level competitive bodybuilder, and there's lots of them that are drug free, how much of their season do they spend strength training? And the vast majority of the very best bodybuilders spend precisely 0 or almost 0% of their season training for strength. And that seems pretty reasonable.
Uh-huh. Uno de los conceptos que has popularizado es el del SFR, el Stimulus to Fatigue Ratio. SFR es una medida de cuánto estímulo obtienes por el costo de fatiga de cualquier tipo de entrenamiento. En tu libro, The Scientific Principles of Hypertrophy Training, enfatizas que este es un concepto central a cualquier tipo de entrenamiento que une tres de los principios más importantes: especificidad, sobrecarga y manejo de la fatiga. ¿Podrías hablarnos un poco más del SFR, particularmente cómo se relaciona con la técnica y el entrenamiento al fallo muscular?
Totally. So, stimulus is not something we can measure very directly, at least not now, at least not very well. Generally speaking, it's something you have a reasonable idea will cause hypertrophy later. So we use a few proxies that we've developed for the book, and we use it at Renaissance Periodization. And one of them is the degree of how much pump you get from training. There's actually been a very recent study published that shows that people that early in the training got the biggest pumps actually grew the most training throughout the training after the following 6 weeks. Just isn't a surprise to anyone that's ever lifted weights for a long time, but some people might find surprising. And then so, how much does something make you pumped? Which is also, by the way, mechanistically, there's all sorts of literature that the pump actually causes hypertrophy. There's how much that, something causes disruption wise. So if you get sore and or very fatigued, how much fall off of performance. So for example, if you're doing bicep curls and your forearms are really tired, but your biceps feel fine, is it a very good chance that you're stimulating the biceps? But gee whiz, stimulus means the muscle is contracting very powerfully. It's depleting its energy products, it's taking on fatigue, and it would ostensibly be very tired. And if it's not, you have to worry about it. And so just, pump, disruption, and a few other sort of ways we can tell, okay, stimulus is occurring. And then if you get those, it's generally a good thing. You think, oh, I'm probably doing a good job. So if you're doing bench press for your pecs get really pumped and they get really sore and they get, very weak, and you can feel a ton of tension during the muscle or during the movement, and like your pecs really feel like they're producing a lot of force. That's probably a really, really good thing. And then we have to ask, okay, well, while those are good things, what about the fatigue cost? So if you're bench pressing and you get an amazing response for your chest, what about if it really hurts your shoulders? So the stimulus could be very good. There was a lot of muscle, but if it hurts your shoulder joint a lot, it's just at the very least not sustainable, because the joint fatigue would sum up over time. And then eventually you actually can't produce a good stimulus because you can't bench anymore without extreme amount of pain. So ideally we look for exercises that, or any sort of training variable, any sort of modality, ideally has the highest amount of stimulus and the lowest amount of fatigue. So if you have some kind of exercise that really just targets the muscle that you want super well, causes huge disruptions, huge pump, huge fall off in training performance for that muscle, and it causes very little joint pain. It's systemically not very taxing. A really good example of an exercise like that for many people is a deficit push-up. Like if you push up with a deficit, it doesn't just beat you up much. It's fine for your shoulders and elbows. It doesn't make you super, super tired. It doesn't interfere with training other muscles much, but it really hammers the pecs super well. And if you're in that situation where you're using that exercise, your stimulus is very high, your fatigue is relatively low, and that's something that sustainably produces pretty good results. And if you do lots and lots of sets of it, it adds a lot of stimulus, but it doesn't add a ton of fatigue, so that you can continue to do it over and over and over and over. On the other hand, there are other exercises, for example, that cause a great deal of stimulus, but also a preposterous amount of fatigue. The conventional deadlift, especially for strong lifters, is a good example. Not for everyone, but for many people, the stimulus is incredible. You get crazy soreness all through your back, glutes and hams and everything, but gee whiz, it beats you up a lot, and it is systemically ultra taxing. So it's not exactly like you could do 3 deadlift sessions for sets of 8 or 10, 4 times a week. Nobody really survived that, and it's just not very sustainable. So the raw stimulus magnitude, just the stimulus side, is very good. The fatigue side is not very good. So it's something that can be used if you have, if your recovery is not a limiting factor, but it's something that you have to use very judiciously, especially if you're advanced and stronger, and especially if you're on, like, let's say, a fat loss phase, and fatigue is something that creeps up very, very quickly for you. And then there's still other exercises which may not have a great stimulus at all and have a huge amount of fatigue. For example, partial squats, for the quadriceps. Do partial squats pump up the quads? Not really. Do they weaken the quads? Not really. Do they cause quad soreness? Not really. And do they tax the joints? Yes. Do they tax systemic fatigue? Yes. So at some point, stimulus to fatigue ratio, the stimulus is here, the fatigue is here. If you do tons and tons of sets of partial squats, you may beat yourself up considerably more than you hypertrophy. And if you just did full depth squats or full depth hack squats or leg presses, you would get a much greater stimulus for the same amount of fatigue, or greater stimulus for even less fatigue, or a little bit less stimulus but almost no fatigue, and that would be really, really good. And your second part of your question was the relationship of failure proximity. And generally speaking, if your failure proximity or RIR is about 5 reps or more away from failure, the stimulus is just not very good. The fatigue's not very high, but anytime you lift weights is fatiguing. So because the stimulus is here and the fatigue is here, the stimulus to fatigue ratio is not that great. Now, if you go anywhere from 3, 4, 5 reps away from failure, all the way to about 1 rep away from failure, the stimulus is considerable and the fatigue isn't that high. So you have a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. Now, if you go and do beyond failure training or train at failure or beyond consistently over and over and over, especially, the stimulus is just marginally higher than it is for like 2 reps in reserve. So, and this has been confirmed by a whole bunch of studies. Sometimes they show the stimulus isn't even higher, but we'll say I think it's a little bit higher. But the fatigue is exponentially higher. So the fatigue is up here. So if you insist on grinding all of your sets to failure and beyond, drop sets, sets with a partner, then what ends up happening is your stimulus is good, but your fatigue is so high that the sustainability of the training is not ideal. So instead of being able to do, let's say, 4 sets of an exercise every week, maybe you can only do 2. Now, if your stimulus per set is here for 2 reps in reserve, and it's here for 0 reps in reserve, 4 sets is here, but you can't do 4 sets if you go all the way to failure. So the stimulus is a really big difference. They say, oh, I go on all the way to failure, but I can only handle so much. You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in that respect. And even if you can survive a good week, maybe you can train 3 weeks consecutively going all the way to failure before you need to deload, your performance drops off. Or if you stay, on average in a mesocycle 2 repetitions in reserve, then you can potentially progress for 6 whole weeks and just get much more muscle growth without having to deload all the time. So the stimulus to fatigue ratio it reflects itself in exercise selection, proximity to failure, and a bunch of other variables. It's probably one of the most central concepts in a scientific approach to bodybuilding. And a lot of times, any idea you have about how to train should, at the very least, look at the stimulus to fatigue ratio and hypothesize, okay, is this going to be good for my SFR, neutral, or bad? And if it's bad, I'd probably tend to try to avoid it. If it's neutral, that's okay. And if it's good, then it's probably something you should actively be trying to do.
Has inventado un algoritmo muy fácil de usar para cuantificar el SFR basado en proxies como el pump, la disrupción muscular, la conexión mente-músculo. ¿Cuáles serían unos pros y contras de usar este método para evaluar un ejercicio comparado a usar análisis biomecánico, en muchos casos análisis biomecánico básico? ¿Cuáles son los pros y contras de cada método?
Yeah. I think biomechanical analysis is a very poor use, is a very bad idea to use as a measurement of stimulus. It is a very, very good way to use a proscriptive method to actually tell you what to do. So biomechanically, if you don't know any biomechanics and I say, hey, go train your biceps, I don't even know what the bicep is. I have no idea what the function of the muscle is. So you'd be like, okay, biceps, okay, overhead press, right? And it's like, no, no, curling the arm. Okay, biomechanics says I need to curl the arm. Then ostensibly that should stimulate because the bicep is the forearm flexor, but it's not the forearm flexor, it's one of the many forearm flexors. So then once biomechanics tells you how to move, generally, you can vary specifically how you adjust your grip, dumbbells, cables, barbells, which way, you move your arm. All of them check the biomechanical boxes generally and say, okay, generally, yeah, you should be using your bicep. But then you say, okay, how pumped do I get? How sore do I get? How much strength loss do I get? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another big one is like, do I feel the tension? There's a mind-muscle connection is one, right? Do I feel, which is very simple, do I feel the tension where I'm supposed to in the target muscle, in the bicep in this case? Do I feel with high reps a burn in the bicep? Imagine a situation in which you're telling someone, okay, biomechanically, this exercise should hit your biceps. And you're saying, okay, cool. And they do it. It's okay. Do you feel tension being produced by your biceps? So I feel it in my forearms and in my brachioradialis. Okay. Do you feel a burn at higher reps in your bicep? Nope. Still forearm brachioradialis. Okay. When 2 days passes after you do these curls, do you feel soreness in the biceps? Like, nope, forearms and brachioradialis. Okay. When you finish the exercise, where do you feel weak? Forearms and brachioradialis. I don't care what the fucking biomechanics, sorry for swearing. I don't care what the biomechanics says. You probably didn't recruit your bicep a whole lot, because had you done so, something would have happened to it, right? Like if you say, okay, there was a battle here in some village and there's no bullet casings, there's no blown up tanks, all the buildings look completely fine. It doesn't look to me like there was a battle here. Now, maybe there was, but if the village next to it is like a huge crater, they say, no, the battle wasn't over there. It was over here. Really? But that village is blown up. Like, no, that's nonsense. That's fake news. You know, say, well, when we typed in the coordinates to shell this village, we were supposed to shell this one. Like, well, I think the coordinates are off because you shelled this one instead. And like, well, no, you just don't know physics, right? So people say, well, biomechanically, this has to activate the lats. Well, biomechanics is wildly complicated. There are individual differences they're insane, and just changing your hand movement or position can alter the recruitment of various muscles. And so biomechanics is a great first principles thing to run on. Once you do that, you have to auto-regulate how much stimulus you're receiving and how much fatigue you're receiving with those proxies, mind-muscle connection, pump, and the sort of the degree of disruption. And if you use both biomechanics to sort of point the way, and then you adjust the way using those proxies, you get, I think, the best of both worlds.
Nunca me ha cuadrado cuando las personas argumentan que no importa si no puedes sentir un ejercicio porque tu cuerpo es muy malo percibiéndolo. No tiene mucho sentido. Si estoy trabajando mis bíceps, me gustaría estar
maybe magically your biceps don't accumulate fatigue. Maybe magically your biceps are completely immune to soreness. That would be cool. It's especially problematic when, another muscle really feels it. So for example, if I tell you, look, this way of incline pressing is going to destroy your pecs, and you say, look, I feel it in my front delts. Maybe you're off. A day later, I go, okay, where are you sore? You poke around, my pecs feel fine. Okay, no worries. That's okay what you feel. You say, but my front delts really hurt. What am I going to do? Tell you it's not front delts? Do we need an MRI study that actually looks in and says, well, there's actually macrostructural mechanical damage in your front delts? Am I still going to say it doesn't tax your front delts? It's kind of insane. Another really good example that I often bring up is lunging. If you lunge with a certain cadence or a certain foot positioning, you can target your quads considerably or your glutes. And sometimes you just don't know, and it requires experimentation. If I'm doing lunges to target my glutes, and my glutes don't feel like they're contracting much during the lunge, my quads are on fire. My quads get a huge pump. My glutes don't feel anything. And after, my quads are sore as hell for 3 days, and my glutes never feel, they completely recover the day after. Am I really going to look at a biomechanical analysis to say, no, yeah, it's a glute exercise? Like, okay. And it's one of those things where, if you're going to posture online and make biomechanical inference, you can still sound smart and still make people look stupid by saying biomechanics is king. But if you're getting ready for a bodybuilding show and the judges said, listen, you need to bring up your glutes or you just won't win. But in your second place 3 times in a row, if your glutes got bigger, you will win your next show. We will absolutely promote you to first place. And you're doing lunges because biomechanics, and your quads are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and your glutes aren't responding. Are you going to lie to yourself? You can if you'd like, but then who are you lying to at that point? So I think how a muscle feels isn't everything. Here's a really good case in point. Beginners just are no good at detecting mind-muscle connection. They just fucking can't tell, right? They can tell you if they got sore or not, sometimes not even. Beginners often don't understand the difference between acute injury perception and soreness. They don't understand the difference between injury and a burn. They say, ow, something's wrong with my tricep. And it's like, well, what do you mean? Are you okay? Did you hear a snap? They're like, no, it hurts. And they're, okay, does it hurt now? They're like, no, now it's gone. Like, aha. Well, that's lactic acid. It's a good part of the thing. It's not a bad thing. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. So beginners are better off focusing on technique. More intermediate people are better off focusing on having the technique, which should be already a thing, and then training really, really hard, getting closer and closer to failure, true failure, which is really tough to get if you're a beginner. Once you're able to have good technique and train very hard, then it's a good idea to start familiarizing yourself with the mind-muscle connection and all the other proxies of stimulus, because you want to really, really double check and make sure you're hitting all the right muscles in the right ways. Because if you're targeting your pecs are, you feel a crazy amount of tension and burn in your pecs are getting pumped and they're getting super sore and super weak. 99 problems of why your pecs aren't growing, but an insufficient stimulus is absolutely not one of them. Whereas if you tell yourself, well, biomechanically, it should be contributing to pec growth, but you don't feel a damn thing, I would be skeptical as to whether or not, certainly your pecs can grow a considerable extent, even if you feel nothing in them, because if they're still generating tension, it's totally fine. Maybe it's just bad at perceiving it. But as a best effort, I would like to see some sort of confirmatory evidence that the pecs are actually experiencing something like a stimulus.
Hablando de este tema, ¿qué tan importante crees que es entrenar un músculo en la posición más corta posible, teniendo en cuenta que 1, no usamos solo un ejercicio, sino muchos ejercicios en distintos planos, y 2, posiblemente la mayor parte del estímulo no venga de esta sección del rango de movimiento, sino cuando estiramos el músculo?
What's interesting about that is precisely in the same several months as A few studies were published demonstrating that the lengthened portion is probably more hypertrophic, potentially in some cases even than the full range of motion, is when I saw a lot of social media biomechanists, none of them degreed in biomechanics, ironically, saying that, oh, this delt exercise is bad because it doesn't fully shorten the delts. And I'm like, wait, hold on a second. Shouldn't we worry about fully lengthening the delts? Like, that's a valid critique. Like, if you're doing lateral raises, from here to here, okay, maybe they should be saying, well, you should do them all the way from here, lengthen delts. This part maybe not very important. I could understand that, but it was just a really odd coincidence that while the literature was showing the lengthened portion is probably more important for hypertrophy, people are talking about, well, this doesn't fully shorten the muscle. Another thing, a critique I've gotten is the top end of flies, like machine flies. I tend to have my elbows bent because it allows me to produce a crap load of force with my pecs and safely stretch my pecs at the bottom. And I've gotten criticism saying, Mike, you should straighten your elbows out so you get a peak contraction of the pecs. And I always ask, how important is the peak contraction? And they said, well, it's important. And I ask, okay, with all due respect, because we're all just learning together, how do you know that? Crickets, fucking crickets. Nobody said anything. And so I think that, there's potentially going to be literature that the shortened position is very important, that it activates parts of the musculature that are not grown by the fully lengthened. I believe that's probably the case, maybe a small amount of musculature that you can get more. So I advocate full range of motion because I think it really does check all the boxes, but preferentially biasing an exercise for shortened position is probably the opposite of what you do if you want to exert a preference. If you want no preference, full range of motion. If you want to exert a preference, the stretch position by a long shot. If you want to say that, fuck the stretch position, let's just do the shortened position, that's really important, I would say that maybe you're right, but the evidence currently does not point in that direction. Logical inference does not point in that direction. Most people's perception of how they respond to exercise does not point in that direction. It does offer some people, I'll be a little critical here, we all do this every now and again, it does offer people some unique ways to criticize others, which gives them social media clout and makes them sound smart. And then maybe they're right, and maybe I'll sound really fucking stupid in 6 months when we learn that the shortened position is even more important than anything. And then I'll gladly jump on that wagon. But for now, the evidence and the reasoning to me does not make a whole lot of sense.
Genial, muchas gracias. ¿Tenemos tiempo para otra pregunta?
Yeah, hell yeah. I mean, how long do you have? I have another 20 minutes at least.
Yeah, I'm great. I have whatever you have.
Whatever. Yeah, keep going.
Ok, entonces 2 preguntas. Las personas todavía piensan que la máquina Smith es mala. ¿Podrías explicarnos por qué es un poco tonto?
Yeah. So, I think there is a tiny grain of truth to where that started. Training athletes on a Smith machine misses out on some of the coordinating effects of lifting. So like a Smith machine, as long as you push in some direction, force transfer with the rails lets the bar go to wherever it's supposed to go. In addition to that, if you position yourself poorly in a Smith machine, it can actually cause quite a bit of shearing stress on the joints. Like if you push your feet way too far out in a Smith machine squat, it necessitates your back having to round in order to hit the bottom position, which under high loads could be not such a great thing. So you have to know how to use a Smith machine in order to make sure that those things don't happen. And for athletic purposes, Smith machines have a very limited application. But I think a third variable that causes most of the revulsion on Smith machines is that it's considered like manlier and tougher to lift the weight by yourself. A machine is almost considered like a crutch. It's like, like a training wheel on a children's bicycle. And for that reason, people seem averse to it. And that's not really a good reason for anything. Manliness is barely a variable. You want to be a real man, go get punched in the face a lot. That'll make you manly. What kind of machines you use at the gym? Probably very little effect on that. So the Smith machine, I think, got a bad rap for those reasons. Two of them potentially valid, but let's take one at a time. The first point on coordination. If we're training people for pure hypertrophy, we don't really care about coordination. If Big Ramy is training on a Smith machine and then he wins the Mr. Olympia again, I don't think anybody cares that he can't position a barbell by himself. Like, who cares? They don't judge you on that. Like, if you're a sport athlete, yeah, sure, Smith machine use should be minimal to non-existent. So that's the first one. Secondly, if you're using a Smith machine and it's hurting your joints, you should use the Smith machine more properly. So it's not an inherent part of the machine that always has to screw you up. It's like, children shouldn't eat with a fork. Well, hold on a second. Yeah, very young children can stab themselves, but if you grow up, people teach you how to use a fork. You can teach it to use it intelligently, and there's very minimal risk. So if you learn how to use a Smith machine properly, that risk goes away. And then lastly, the manliness thing, that's just not really a reason at all. We're training for hypertrophy, not manliness. A lot of females are significantly hypertrophied and they're not manly at all. And, you don't win bodybuilding shows, or you don't impress people at the beach based on manliness. And, can you imagine going up on stage and you take second place and you're like, come on, judges, I use free weights. They're like, nobody cares. They don't only care how you look. So for using a machine for hypertrophic stimulus, that's the only thing we care about. So those concerns of Smith machine are all valid, except for the manliness thing. That's weird. But, they can be remediated, no problem. And then a Smith machine is a very intelligent tool. So I think a lot of people use their anti-Smith machine sentiment. It's just shorthand for not having to think about it much. When you think about it, you're like, oh, that actually makes sense. And it's a very good tool that's in our toolbox.
Sí, y también las personas que odian la máquina Smith por algún motivo no tienen problema con usar una prensa hack squat, aun cuando dicen que no usas los músculos estabilizadores. ¿No los usarías igual en ninguna máquina?
Yeah, I think what they think of as a Smith machine is not a tool in of its own sake. They seem to think that it is a replacement for the barbell. To them, it's kind of like, it's comparing a bad steakhouse to a really good steakhouse to spaghetti dinner you make at home. The leg press is spaghetti dinner you make at home. And you can't say, well, why don't you go to a steakhouse? I'm eating at home. It's okay. If you go to a steakhouse, it better be a good one. So if you're going to do squats, they better be in the rack. It's just, I would say the Smith machine is Chinese food. The squat rack is the steak, and the leg press is spaghetti at home. They're all just good options, whichever one you need at the time.
Perfecto. La última pregunta, si está bien.
Of course.
Ok. Algunas personas todavía promueven la idea que bloquear tus articulaciones, especialmente las rodillas, es automáticamente lesivo. Te va a lastimar. ¿Es verdad que las prensas, hack squats, sentadillas con un rango de movimiento completo, bloqueando al final, te van a dar algún tipo de COVID de rodilla?
Knee COVID, knee Ebola. There's all kinds of. I heard a really good one. Measles, knee measles. So this is again, to paraphrase Thomas Sowell, an excellent example of a notion. People talk about it. It's never phrased as a hypothesis. It's saying, okay, what exactly are you worried about? Are you worried about chronic injury? What is the mechanism? Are you worried about acute injury? What is the mechanism? And then usually people's single line of evidence is that they've seen, quote unquote, this is direct quote, tons of videos on YouTube of people, quote, snapping their shit up, knee hyperextension. Those videos are very difficult to watch. But I've called out a few people on this before. I said, oh, really, tons. How many? How many videos have you seen? And pushed. They're like, I don't know, 3. Like all of fucking YouTube, 3 videos. So I ask you another question. It's very related. Do you drive a car? And they go, Have you ever seen any videos of car accidents on YouTube? And they're like, do you not drive a car for that reason? They're like, well, I have to get from point A to point B. Like, okay, so then why don't you walk? And they're like, well, walking sucks. Well, me not walking out on leg press means that I don't get to restabilize myself if the reps get out of control, which really is a recipe for injury. It doesn't let me take mile rep rest breaks. And the probability of knee injury through hyperextension, people with healthy joints, that decelerate towards the end range is tiny. Now, if I was pushed to say, if I really wanted to 100% make sure I couldn't hyperextend and cause injury that way, would I lock out my knees? The answer is I would not. But I think because of the advantages of resting at the top and taking a few breaths and the advantages of making sure I standardize my range of motion, and for just pure comfort, I prefer to lock out my knees because the trade-off of what is the chance that I hyperextend my knees is so infinitesimally small. Actually, I'll ask you a question. I'll put you on the spot. Name a competitive bodybuilder who has hyperextended their knees training.
No conozco ninguno.
I don't know anyone. I know tons of people that are torn their pecs. I know tons of people that are torn their quads. I'm not aware of any competitive bodybuilders. And oh my God, these guys lift 1 trillion pounds of weight and tons of them lock out their knees. The real way you get into trouble is 2 ways. One, you have a genetic joint laxity disorder, like that woman with the leg press video I'm sure you saw. She just locked out and then it just kept going. This is very rare. It's almost impossible. You would feel pain when you weren't hyperextended, and it would be extreme, and it would have seconds and seconds and seconds to stop yourself. She never felt any of that, and she just kept going. The other 2 videos I'm familiar with is a gentleman from the Middle East and a gentleman from what looks like India, and they're actively pressing down with loads that are so super maximal So the guy from the Middle East was lifting like, I don't know, 3,000 pounds, and he was not that strong. Not Ronnie Coleman. Okay, maybe he was as strong as you or me. We're not lifting 3,000. If you tell me, hey, you got to lift 3,000 pounds in a leg press, and you got to straighten your knees, I'd be like, fuck you. I'm not going to die on this machine. And then, of course, the guy, the Indian dude who pushed his knees all the way through, was literally lifting a truck. Like, that's what he was doing. So if you're not doing any crazy shit like that, then you're probably very safe, and on the net balance is fine. Now, that's just the acute injury risk. People say that chronically locking out your elbows and locking out your knees is bad for you. And to them, I ask for two things. One is evidence. And they could say, well, look, the studies haven't been conducted, so we have to work on anatomical and physiological inference, which is totally fine. So please infer how that's bad. They say, well, there's forces. I gotcha. When you walk, there's also forces. And they're like, yeah, but those are very low. I gotcha. When you jump and land, the forces through your knees are like multiply higher than your body weight. If you jump up as high as you can and you land, the impact force that travels through your knees is almost certainly higher than anything you could ever squat for that little second. And in it, the rise in force development is really rapid, which correlates to a really high probability of injury. So if there's, do you tell people not to do gymnastics, not to do basketball? Holy shit, that's a suicide sport. You'll really fuck up your knees. But people play basketball their entire lives and are totally fine. And lifting occurs under so much control, so slowly. And here's the last kicker, and I'll finish off with this. If under controlled conditions, you expose adaptive systems to a stress and manage fatigue, they generally get stronger. So if you lock out your elbows over time, your elbows get really good at doing this, and then they get better. So if you treat the body as a really fragile system with no adaptive potential, Jesus, you're going to try to avoid all kinds of shit, and then you'll just continue to be fragile. But if you gently, gingerly explore areas of range of motion and build up over time, a lot of the times your body gets stronger for it. So the idea that lockouts are bad, I would say just mostly mythology. Yeah, don't do dumb shit, but outside of that, I think it's totally fine.
No hay forma de adaptarte a la posición extendida si nunca extiendes.
Oh, no, for sure. But, those guys would say, well, there's no way to adapt to it either way. It just causes chronic, deleterious situation. And then you ask them how they know that. And they say, well, I used to do this and my knees and elbows are fucked up. Anecdotal evidence is better than no evidence, but not much. And then, you look at Olympic weightlifters who only extend with snatches and clean and jerk. And the vast majority of them, even in the later years, have lower rates of musculoskeletal dysfunction than people who never trained. So how the fuck does that work? You should expect them to be really just dilapidated and quadriplegic, but they're generally not. And, that at least can cause you a bit of pause. So maybe it's not a convincing argument that all this stuff is 100% safe, but you should at the very least not be very convinced with the argument that this is very, very dangerous and very, very bad for you.
Mike, muchas gracias por tu tiempo hoy. Fuiste muy amable. Creo que aprendimos mucho. ¿Hay algún lugar donde las personas puedan encontrarte, seguirte, comprar tus cosas?
Stuff. So thank you so much for that plug. YouTube is probably the best place to find me nowadays, and there's all the links on YouTube to everything else. So YouTube, Renaissance periodization. If you can't spell that, and I sure as hell don't know how to spell it, then you just type in Dr. Mike Hypertrophy. If that's hard to spell, Dr. Mike Strength, Dr. Mike Israetel, just type in Dr. Mike Israel, close enough, and the algorithm will find me. Click subscribe or whatever, watch a couple of videos. And we have a lot of fun on YouTube. Thank you so much.